Any good story requires conflict. Something that doesn't impede the narrative, but rather drives the protagonist towards their end goal along a desired path, like a funnel. An empty world with no challenge to overcome is boring. Stories not only require conflict, they are defined by their conflict. Video games are no different, as conflict prompts player interaction. The most common way games evoke conflict is by introducing a roster of enemies. From monster to military, having a tangible roadblock is the key to player progression. Enemies and adversaries are a vital design tool that must be wielded with grace and purpose to create incredible experiences. When executed properly, enemies include diversity in their visuals and functionality, and most importantly, they motivate the player, restricting them in ways that encourage interesting approaches to problems and creative solutions. Doom is revered as a classic, and deservedly so. Obviously, it was a technical marvel of its time, but I would also like to attribute some of its legacy to the expertly designed roster of demons. Doom has 9 total enemies. I'm counting the Spectre as a variant of the Pinky Demon. Through their unique strengths, weaknesses, and behaviors, they compel the player to react with a diverse array of strategies. At the most basic level, you can sort all of Doom's enemies, along with most FPS enemies, into 3 groups: hitscan, projectile, and melee. Bullets fired by hitscan enemies are registered instantly when the trigger is pulled, and they have no travel time. Projectile-based attacks, on the other hand, launch a physical object that takes up space and moves through the air. This means that projectiles can have a travel time, can be affected by gravity, and can be dodged. Within these groups, we don't have identical enemies though. Changing simple stats can make for a totally different gameplay experience from enemy to enemy. If we take a look at the Imp and the Cacodemon, 2 projectile hurling enemies, the most obvious change between the two is that the Imp has significantly less health. In some cases, that alone would make for a new and interesting challenge. The idea of a quote-unquote bullet sponge might sound boring, and alone it can be. But in Doom's case, the Cacodemon having more health means that the player needs to spend more time dodging projectiles and focusing their attention on the Cacodemon, while weaker enemies have the chance to become a problem. But health isn't the only difference between the Imp and the Cacodemon. In Doom, each demon has a behavior variable called pain time. Pain is a split second after getting damaged, where a demon gets stunned and cannot move nor attack the player. The Imp has a pain time of a little over 100 milliseconds. The Cacodemon, on the other hand, has a pain time at 3 times that, a whopping 345 milliseconds. That makes the Cacodemon have the highest pain time in the game. This encourages a response to the Cacodemon that is unique from other enemies. It asks the player to use a weapon that has a high fire rate in order to suppress its attacks, and makes encounters with the Cacodemon feel distinct from fights with other enemies on the roster. Much like this specific scenario, the theme of weapon switching and using the right weapon for every engagement pervades all of Doom. To aid with the player's ability to interpret an engagement, each enemy has a distinct color and silhouette, which makes them distinguishable quickly at a distance, as well as while moving at high speeds. How the player reacts to each different demon or group of demons is crucial, and the distinguished demon designs make the process smooth. The outcome of fights come down to the player's quick decision-making rather than dumb luck. Needing to quickly recognize the differences between enemies isn't a problem unique to Doom. It's something that should be considered in all games. Diversity of mechanics between enemies is crucial to facilitating interesting and varied player reactions. Diversity of aesthetics between enemies is crucial to letting those mechanics be reacted to in the first place. Making changes to health, speed, or damage are basic, but altering niche parameters like pain time can make for way more interesting engagements. Contrast Doom's enemy roster to that of id's previous game, Wolfenstein 3D. Right away you can see that the distribution of enemy types skews further towards hitscan, which is arguably the more boring type of enemy to engage with in an FPS. On top of this, the visuals and gameplay of these enemies are lacking in the distinction that made Doom's roster so great. For example, the Guard, Officer, and SS are all visually similar. On top of this, they play similarly, due to being balanced with smaller, less interesting stat changes. The demons of Doom are diverse in both visuals and functionality, creating more dynamic engagements where the player must make important decisions. Doom holds up infinitely better than Wolfenstein 3D for multiple reasons, the diversely designed demons without a doubt being one of them. Some might say zombies are overdone, and they may have a point, but no cliché holds a story or game back inherently. Instead, a cliché can arbitrarily restrict development. During the production of Left 4 Dead, Gabe Newell asked if it was truly best for the enemies to be zombies. It turns out the answer was yes, but asking that question when using what could be considered cliché remains important, as you should view alternative options that could possibly be better. The Horde makes zombies interesting. Alone, they're weak and fragile. If you let their numbers grow, however, now you have a problem on your hands. Add in some diversity in zombie types like Left 4 Dead's Special Infected, and managing the Horde becomes a puzzle in itself. For this reason, zombies are great at invoking unique strategies from players in a natural way. The Horde fosters dynamic difficulty, and they are a blank slate for developers to use to imbue their game with a lesson for players. Similarly to how Demons and Doom create the need for the player to learn to use weapon switching, Left 4 Dead uses a roster of Special Infected to compel players to work together as a team. The most effective way to play the game requires sticking together. Anyone who lags too far behind or thinks they can survive alone and run off ahead will quickly get punished. This main idea, teamwork, is what all the Special Infected are designed around. This central theme is how Left 4 Dead's enemy design differs from that of Doom. Designing a roster of enemies around a singular idea creates focused direction from the game to encourage the players to play a certain way. Left 4 Dead uses this to force the player to rely on their team and places them in situations that teach them how to do so. So let's take a look at the individual Special Infected. Firstly are the Boomer and Spitter, which attempt to split the players apart from one another and encourage them to try to stick together. The Boomer's bile blinds the players and attracts a horde of common infected. When it gets killed, it explodes, sending bile in all directions, which can cause a whole lot of confusion if the players are in close range.
The Boomer's vomit has a couple of very interesting game mechanics. Along with being temporarily blinded with vomit in their eyes, whoever is hit by the vomit becomes it, and the incoming horde of zombies only attacks that player, essentially leaving him to the mercy of his teammates' willingness to protect him. The other players who have not been vomited on have to make a quick decision about how to deal with this new situation.
To survive this, players must group up and protect the affected players from the oncoming horde. Alternatively, the Spitter sends out puddles of spit, which are dangerous AoE Molotov-like attacks. These cause more of a physical separation or barrier between players. The Charger, Hunter, Smoker, and Jockey all severely punish lone players.
Early versions of Left 4 Dead allowed more skillful players to run off on their own without much fear of deadly consequences, bobbing and weaving around the infected before they could react. The addition of player slowdown when hit by a common infected severely reduced the player's ability to simply run straight through the horde. More importantly, the Hunter Pounce and Smoker Hang presented fatal situations for a player on his own. These additions instilled the fear of being alone in even the most seasoned of FPS players, reinforcing the value of tight teamwork.
They can each pin or capture a survivor in different ways. When pinned, you need help from your team to escape. In most cases, this isn't much of a problem. A couple shots from a teammate and you're free. If you ran off on your own and disregarded your fellow survivors, you're screwed. The Charger, Smoker, and Jockey all also physically move you away from your team when they pin you, making them share similarities to the Boomer and Spitter as well. The two boss infected, the Tank and the Witch, simply add loads of chaos to an already chaotic situation, and usually require the effort of multiple players working together to deal with them. All of these enemies work together to teach the players a simple mantra: stick together and work together. Left 4 Dead is revered as a classic, and deservedly so. Obviously it is one of the greatest co-op experiences of all time, but I would also like to attribute some of its legacy to the expertly designed roster of infected. Left 4 Dead has 9 total enemies, and so does Doom. Now, that's just a coincidence, right? Or does an optimal number of enemies in a game exist? This shared, oddly specific trait got me thinking and counting. Does this trend continue, or have an explanation? The answer that I found was yes and maybe. Miller's Law, a psychological concept created by George A. Miller, states that a typical individual can hold between 5 and 9 items in their working memory before retention drops off. Miller came to this conclusion by analyzing a series of experiments performed by others, all of which tested the channel capacity of people. An experiment was performed by Erwin Pollack by asking participants to properly organize sounds of different frequencies given to them. However many sounds they could organize correctly without making mistakes would indicate their channel capacity. It went something like this. The experiment starts with the participants hearing a series of tones at different frequencies, in their proper order, from lowest to highest. Each of these sounds are given a number according to where they appear in the order. Then the participants are given the same series of tones again, but in a random order. They're asked to assign the number that was given to the tone earlier based on its proper order in the series. The number of tones given to the participant is known as the variance, or information transmitted, and the number of tones that the participant organizes correctly is known as information received. Pollock found that as they increase the information transmitted, the received information increases linearly until participants were asked to differentiate between 5 or more tones, where mistakes became frequent. This trend continues. No matter how many tones were given to the listener, they could not transmit more than 6. This marks their channel capacity. Miller analyzed several experiments similar to this, each of which tested people's ability to hold information in memory. From volume to taste to points on a line, Miller saw an oddly tight trend between differing experiments. No matter the type of information being conveyed, their channel capacities were all around 7, with a maximum of 9. This concept already makes a bit of sense when applied to games. If people can only hold 9 items in memory, having a maximum of 9 enemy types to think about would make for a better experience, right? After all, Doom has 9 demons, Left 4 Dead has 9 infected, Team Fortress 2 has 9 classes, Tetris has 7 blocks, and chess has 6 pieces. There are 2 main issues that quickly arise. Firstly, when applied to things other than simple digits or tones, Miller's law becomes pseudoscience. Enemies in games are far more interesting and far more memorable than... Miller even goes on to address this in his own essay, citing things like words and faces as not applying so neatly to the rule of 7 plus or minus 2. Despite this, I still think that the concepts that Miller's law brings are valuable. Variance and channel capacity can both apply to game design. You want a game with a lot of variance, as this directly connects to the diversity displayed in a roster of enemies, but more variance can easily overwhelm. It's a balancing act. Also, just by looking at well-designed enemy rosters, 9 seems like a successful upper limit. The second issue is, you can probably also think of countless games that have more than 9 types of enemies. For example, the Mario series has an all-time roster of many enemies, but they use a somewhat obvious strategy of compartmentalizing enemies in each individual level or world. If we take a look at Super Mario World specifically, most levels host only 4 types of enemies, and no level has more than 9, other than Bowser's Castle. I decided to count the enemies in a couple more Mario games. It seems like it continues to apply. Looking back at other non-Mario games, there are over 1,000 Pokemon, but no team contains more than 6. Games like Valorant, Overwatch, and League of Legends all have large and ever-growing character rosters with unique abilities and playstyles. They all, however, limit team size, so no game will have an overwhelming diversity of enemies. Minecraft has many different enemy types, but they're all biome, structure, or dimension specific. You will nearly never encounter more than 9 different enemy types at one time. This compartmentalization of enemies, used by countless games, works to amass a massive bestiary without overwhelming the player. Breaking this quote-unquote rule intentionally can create greater challenges or test the player's knowledge. Increasing the amount of information being conveyed to the player requires that they have a greater channel capacity, or expects them to have committed each enemy's behavior to long-term memory. Using this in the form of a boss level or extra challenge showcases the culmination of the player's skills and knowledge. If we take things into the opposite direction, games can also work with very few enemies. Project Zomboid, for example, compensates with many status effects that the player needs to manage. Compartmentalization of 5 to 9 enemies to each level or engagement is a great way to keep a game fresh and interesting, with a higher diversity while not surpassing the player's channel capacity. Another great way to do this is introduce variants of existing enemies. Doom Spectre that I mentioned earlier is a variant of the Pinky Demon, being identical in stats with a translucent texture. This makes it harder to see, especially in dark environments, which hosts new interesting challenges for the player while not overwhelming them. Implementing this form of pseudo-diversity with enemy variants can help to do just that, increasing the variety of enemies while maintaining the needed channel capacity at a manageable level. I wanted to bring back Minecraft's enemy roster as I believe it has some of the best designed enemy variants. Minecraft is a game about discovery and creativity, so having a large roster of enemies can help to support this theme of discovery. At the same time, however, too many enemies can overwhelm a player. It could lead to too much to think about while exploring and be annoying rather than interesting and fun. While many of Minecraft's monsters are simply variants of the original roster, they still manage to be interesting to discover and fight. Take the Husk, Stray, and Bogged for example. These are all functionally the same as the zombie and skeleton, respectively, to fight. They have the same movement, attack damage, and health, but their attacks inflict various effects, with the player's superior speed being the main reason experienced players may consider common mobs too easy. Incurring hunger or slowness can be quite punishing. This makes for an interesting and unique challenge provided by a familiar enemy. Not to mention, I just think they visually look cool. Mojang's variants are far higher effort than a traditional recolor, which helps further develop the idea of discovery in Minecraft. Without interesting new things to discover, this whole concept falls apart. If the Drowned was just a blue zombie, its existence would provide very little extra variance of information for the player to discover. Instead, it looks like it's covered in seaweed, and it makes different sounds. It drops a unique item, and even at times uses the Trident, a weapon exclusive to the Drowned. All of these together continue to add to the variance of information fed to the player. But it's better to look at this as parallel information, as it increases the total transmitted information without surpassing the player's channel capacity. Enemies drive gameplay in most cases. A good roster of enemies can make a game, and without well-designed enemies, you're left with a boring or dull experience. There's nothing wrong with taking inspiration from the greats, whether it be Doom's diverse visuals and gameplay, or Left 4 Dead's lessons hidden within the infected. A player's motivation lies in the enemies they face.